his education, he was born and raised in Paris, France, and as a teenager he grew up in the Philadelphia area. I think he and Lucy have already made some connections there. And his educational background, he has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Haverford College in Pennsylvania, and he did major study in Greek archaeology at Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania, and then he got a master's degree in art history from New York University, and his PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania with a major in American architecture. He actually, since he came to Vermont in 2016, has been a visitor guide, that's how I know him, and a great one, by the way, at the Shelburne Museum. And he's also on the Shelburne Historic Preservation and Design Commission. He worked for 22 years as a professor of art history and architectural history at Baldwin Wallace University in Berea, Ohio. And during that time, he took many study groups of students to trips in Europe, architectural and history trips in Europe. Please welcome Marc, and I'd also like to introduce his mom, Irene, who's here visiting with us. She recently moved to Vermont, and his husband, Alex. So give them a happy welcome.
Thanks, Craig. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'm really looking forward to it on this cold day, but hopefully thoughts of Greece will warm your heart. Let me turn off the lights. There. Can you all see that okay? Yes. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. So obviously this church is really quite a landmark, right? Right at the foot of Cherry Street on Winooski Avenue. And it's really, really distinctive, of course, for its tower and its monumental sort of temple front with its white columns. And today, in the 45, 50 minutes that you are my captives in this room, I'm going to talk about how the Greek revival came about, how it came to Vermont, how this church fits into that story. And I'll also be dragging along some politicians and bankers and presidents who were part of that story, the rise of the Greek revival, and also the downfall of the Greek revival. So we're going to hear the whole story in about 45 to 50 minutes. So fasten your seatbelts. Bumpy ride. So I want to start off maybe with this slide, because it shows you how neoclassicism, as you probably know, was really important in the founding documents of this country, the Constitution, and also our system of government was really based on partly Greek and Roman ideals. And that was also true, of course, with art and architecture. And the early Republic really looked to the Greek and Roman past for inspiration. And this print, of course, is a great example of that. It's from about 1815, so the early decades of the Republic. And you see a personification here of, are you good with Greek mythology? Who could that be? She's wearing a helmet, Athena. And she's got a shield. Athena, excellent, right? Athena or Minerva. And she's pointing to the personification of America, right? Holding a shield as well. So up until now, America was usually shown as a Native American woman. But now, after independence, she looks more like a Roman Republican figure, right? The Roman figure. And to the right, of course, is George Washington, an equestrian statue of George Washington, standing in front of a great triumphal arch from ancient Rome, right? So there you go, those sort of ancient Roman symbols. And over here, you've all recognized him with his winged helmet and his caduceus. Who could that be from Roman mythology? Mercury, right? Hermes, the messenger god. And he's looking to Ceres or Demeter, the goddess of agriculture. So you see all these things coming together here, looking to the Greek and Roman past for inspiration, right, in this print, showing you America guided by wisdom, right? They knew that Athena was the goddess of wisdom, right? There she is right there. And what's at the feet of America? It's a big basket with fruits and wonderful things to eat. No brownies, they're over there. It's a cornucopia, right? Corn of plenty, cornu, Latin corn, copious, plenty, right? So it's a cornucopia, and that's also taken from Roman mythology. We also have similar things going on in architecture, right? So this building is also clearly inspired by the Greek and Roman past. It's the first bank of the US in Philadelphia, right? It was chartered in 1791, and this building was built in 1795. Why Philadelphia? It was the capital of the United States, right, from 1790 to 1800, before the capital moved to Washington. So, how majestic, how monumental, right? You've got a sweeping flight of steps leading to the entrance. You've got this huge portico with Corinthian order columns. You've got a pediment, and whoa, you've got a cornucopia, right? And an eagle, right? Great symbols. And then you've got these giant pilasters on the side. The whole thing, the whole facade is lined with marble. So clearly, the architect, Samuel Blodgett, I really shouldn't call him an architect because that was not really his profession. He was a tradesman by profession. But he dabbled in architecture, right? He was what we call a gentleman or amateur architect. So he designed this bank building, obviously looking back to the Roman past for inspiration, to make this building monumental and grand, right? That's what the early republic needed for its government buildings, like this bank, right? And I love this comparison of these two buildings. There is our friend, the first bank, right, from the 1790s. And I'm comparing it to Independence Hall, right, or the State House, built in the 1730s in that sort of, Georgian colonial style. Look how shockingly different this great neoclassical building was in Philadelphia. Nothing like this had ever been built in Philadelphia up until now, right? Although they kind of cheated. You can see the side walls are all brick, right? To save money, and they put all their money in the front, right? In the facade, people would really walk by and see. So this building was really quite striking in Philadelphia when it was built in 1797. Very different from the Georgian colonial buildings that you could see elsewhere in the city. Well, there are three basic ways that Europeans and Americans got to know the ancient world. Number one, taking the grand tour. Number two, archaeological excavations. And number three, prints and drawings. The grand tour was really popular with the British, right, and Germans. They loved to go to Italy, travel, soak up the sun, look at the ancient ruins, study all of these. And they usually stayed 2, 3, 4 years. This is not your 1-week vacation, right? This is a real serious study for mostly wealthy Britishers, wealthy people who could afford to go to Italy for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, study the ancient world, study the Roman ruins, and also buy a lot of ancient antiquities and bring them back to their estates in England. So that's the grand tour, and that really introduced a lot of Northern Europeans to ancient Roman ruins. And here is Goethe, the great German philosopher, sitting in the Roman countryside, looking a little brooding actually, surrounded by Roman ruins. Right? He stayed 2 years in Italy. The second thing that made the ancient world known to Europeans and Americans was, of course, the rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Right? These two cities had mostly been buried by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79, and they'd mostly been forgotten. And then in the mid-18th century, they were sort of discovered again and seriously excavated. So here is a drawing of an etching of the excavations of the Temple of Isis at Pompeii, which happened in the 1760s. And this spurred a whole new mania for things that were Roman, right, for ancient Roman art. Because what's neat about Pompeii, if you've been there, it's not about grand triumphal arches or Colosseum-like buildings, it's about ordinary things, right? Bakeries, furniture, shops, houses. And nobody had really studied that before. So the rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum really galvanized European thoughts about ancient Rome. And Pompeii had about maybe 15,000 people when it was pretty much destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. That's as big as Bennington or Brattleboro, just to give you a sense of scale, right? It wasn't a really major city, but nonetheless. And the third way that Europeans and Americans got to know the ancient world was through Giovanni Piranesi, right? He is so crucial to our understanding of the ancient world because he went to Rome, well, he was Roman, actually, he was from Italy, and he made etchings and prints of what he saw, right? And he published these in a book called Vedute di Roma, right? Views of Rome. He was like the Rick Steves, right? So he took him a while to publish all these, but they became really popular, right? Everyone wanted their hands on these prints. And look how evocative his views of the ancient world in Rome was. You know, really interesting compositions and angles, really dramatic lighting. So what's really interesting is that when people came to Rome, they were often disappointed because what they saw didn't match what Piranesi had depicted, right? So there's a little bit of a letdown there. So here's the Arch of Titus. If you've been to Rome, of course, you know that it's at the foot of the Forum. So those are the three main ways Europeans and Americans got to know the ancient world, right? The Grand Tour, if you're wealthy, the publications that followed the excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum, and finally, prints and etchings of ancient Roman ruins. And then there are these guys. They're crucial to our story of the Greek revival. Nicholas Rivet on the left, and James Athenian Stuart on the right. Athenian was a nickname he got because he was so into ancient Greece, right? So these were architects and archaeologists who didn't go to Rome. No, they bucked the trend. They went to Greece, which was really unusual because Greece was really exotic, right, for Western Europeans. It was far away. It had been under Ottoman Turkish occupation since the 15th century. So it was really this faraway exotic world. But they went there. They wanted to see ancient Greek architecture with their own eyes. So they come back to England, and 10 years later, they published this, Bombshell. This is such an important book, right? The Antiquities of Athens, measured and delineated, right, by James Stuart and Nicholas Rivet. If you know your Roman numerals, you can tell me what date it was published. Because I forgot. 1762, right? 1762. So this was so important. It's the first time that Greek temples and buildings were carefully measured and studied and published, right? Up until Stuart and Rivet, people really didn't quite know that there was a real difference between Greek and Roman architecture. It was all like this big antiquity soup, right? They hadn't realized that one was really older than the other. So this really spurred an interest in Greek architecture and studying it precisely. This is not from their book, but it shows you how they really galvanized interest in the careful scientific study of ancient Greek architecture with the three orders that you're familiar with, of course, today: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and their ratios and how it all fits together. So Stuart and Rivet, really important in the dissemination of this more focused study of ancient Greece. Well, remember this bank, a great example of neoclassical architecture. Its charter was not renewed 20 years after it was founded in 1791. So in 1811, it's gone. There's no bank. So they chartered another bank. The Congress chartered another bank, the second bank of the US. And for that, this man, who we'll be hearing a lot about today, was really crucial. Nicholas Biddle, right? He was a wealthy financier. He dabbled in politics. He became the president of this second bank. And he's the one who basically wrote the program for this architectural competition to design a new bank, right? The new second bank. And Nicholas Biddle, he's an amazing guy. He traveled to Greece when he was 20. And he believed there were only two truths in the world: the Bible and Greek architecture. That's it. So he was really instrumental in hiring this guy to build the second bank, right? William Strickland. And here he is in this portrait in front of that famous building that you'll see in 2 seconds. 1, 2. There it is, right there. The second bank of the US. The first Greek Revival building in America. Think about it. The first Greek Revival building in America. Right there. So you can see, wow, what a difference from the earlier first bank, right, from the 1790s. This looks so much more like a Greek temple, right? It's got Doric columns in front. It doesn't have a little portico. And instead, this pediment here, the triangular area around the columns and beneath the roof, it's called a pediment. It's the entire width of the building, right? And the area above the columns have all the correct things that Doric buildings have, right? The little triglyphs, those little grooves, and the little square keys in between, right? And all marble, not just the facade, the whole thing, right, is made of marble. So you can see how much more monumental and imposing this second bank of the US was, built in the late 1818 and early 1820s. And it's the first building, obviously modeled after the Parthenon, right, clearly, which is also a Doric building, a Doric temple. But there's a problem. This is not a Greek temple. It's a bank, for crying out loud, right? So, Strickland and many Greek Revival architects obviously had to make some changes. Number one, he raised the whole building on a sort of Roman-style podium, right? See, the whole building is standing on a platform to make it visible and to make it much more imposing on the street. And where are the columns on the side? They're gone, right? He didn't put columns on the side because, number one, it's too expensive. And number two, you need light to come into the building, right? Because the building is a bank. You need light for your bank offices and things like that. So by taking away the columns and putting in windows, that's a big change from the Greek temple, right? Greek temples were not used for prayer, right? In ancient Greece, you worshipped outside the temple. The only thing inside the temple was the treasury and a statue of the god or goddess. So they didn't have windows. They didn't need them, right? But because this is a bank, you need windows. So a few changes, but overall, it's obviously modeled after the Parthenon. And what a presence it had, right? Look at this picture from 1859. It's like it's landed from outer space in the middle of these brick and stone row houses in Philadelphia. Wow, what a presence. Strickland, of course, looked back to the ancient past, to the Greek past, when he designed other buildings, other firsts, in a way, in American architecture. This is the first stock exchange building in America, right? The Merchants Exchange building, built in Philadelphia in the 1830s. And you can see the first bank right there. They're basically a stone's throw away from each other, right? And this is the Nashville, this is the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville, which Strickland also designed. He actually died in the middle of construction, and he's actually buried inside the Capitol. One of the few architects, I think, who's buried in a Capitol building. Well, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, Mark, that looks familiar, right? Well, you know it does. That's the choragic monument of Lysistrata, right? And it's in Athens. It was built in the middle of the 4th century BCE as a monument to honor Lysistrata, who was a very wealthy patron of the arts and of a choral group who won a competition, who won a singing competition. So they built this monument to honor him, right? Not the actual choir, but the man who funded the choir, right? So that's Lysistrata. And it was published in Stuart and Rivette's book from 1762. So that's how it became very, very famous, right? It's also the first building in ancient Greece to have Corinthian columns on the outside. Right? So it's a pretty important building. Today, of course, when you're walking around Athens, you walk right by it. Most people have no idea what this is. But you do, right? Don't make that mistake of walking right by it as you're going to that souvlaki stand. You'll know exactly what this is. Very well.
It took a while to find that.
Yeah, it is hard to find. Yeah, it's sort of tucked away, hidden away in Athens. But anyway, here it is. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our church. So you're thinking, Mark, this is really lovely, but what about the Greek revival in Vermont? Get to it. Here we are. Windsor, Vermont. You're probably thinking, oh, he's going to talk about Burlington. No. Windsor, Vermont, right? That's where the Greek revival first appeared. Why Windsor, Vermont? Well, a couple of things. Number one, it was the biggest town in Vermont in the 1820s, 3,000 people. Burlington had only 2,000 people at that time, right? So Windsor was bigger. It was also very important historically, right? It's the birthplace of Vermont, right? It's where the Vermont Constitution was signed in 1777, right? Making Vermont a republic, independent nation for 14 years that it was. And it was also the first capital of Vermont before it moved to Montpelier in 1805. So by having the Greek revival style here, the Windsorites, Windsorians? The people of Windsor were saying, we're important, we're civilized, we have culture, we know the latest architectural trends, Greek revival, right? Have you picked it up?
No.
I know. It's right there. Let's see, right there. No, it was wrong. Sorry, it's right there. Right there. There it is, St. Paul's Episcopal Church, right? The first building in Vermont built in the Greek revival style. It was designed by Alexander Paris. Who's Alexander Paris? Well, he was born in Massachusetts. He got trained with a house painter, worked in Portland for a little bit, and then moved to Boston, right? And he became the city's most important architect after Charles Bulfinch was out of the way. And he designed the first Greek revival church in New England. Right? There it is, right on Tremont Street, Cathedral Church of St. Paul, right? And, you know, Paris was really smart. He wanted his building to really stand out. So, if you look at this photograph of Tremont Street today, what do you see across the street? This building right here, the Park Street Church from 1806. And it's in that sort of typical colonial meeting house look, brick rectangular box with the tower and steeple. Well, look how different Paris's building is, right? Greek temple front, stone, colonnade in front. So really, really different from that more traditional colonial sort of brick church that we're used to seeing. And by the way, Peter Banner, who designed the Park Street Church in 1806, also designed the Unitarian Church on Church Street. So when Paris designed the St. Paul's in Windsor, a couple years later than his Cathedral Church of St. Paul in Boston, not quite as radical, right? He's still using brick. But overall, you see how the Greek revival is making itself felt here in this little building. You've got the temple front, you've got the pediment running the entire width of the building. You've got Ionic columns here in the side of the entrance. So it has some Greek revival touches, right? And we can safely say it is indeed the first Greek revival church in, or building in Vermont. And he was really breaking a lot of traditions when he did that, right? Because New England church architecture is very conservative, right? Here is the Old North Church in Boston from 1723 by John Smibert. Here is the Unitarian Church in Burlington from 100 years later. Same thing, right? Same, pretty much same composition. As you can see, made of brick, tower, belfry, double row of windows. So I think you can appreciate how novel, in a way, Paris's building was, right? He got rid of the tower, he included these columns, and you've got this great sweeping pediment across the entire width of the building. Paris, of course, went on to design a lot of buildings, including the Cringy Market in Boston, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, in that sort of austere granite style that he became really famous for. Well, how did these architects get to know the ancient world, and how did they really learn their trade? There were no architecture schools at all until MIT in the 1860s. So how did they learn their trade? Well, architects really used pattern books, right? Pattern books, which were books that were published with advice about how to build buildings, right? From top to bottom. And the most important of these pattern books was Asher Benjamin's pattern books. He was the first American to publish pattern books in America, right? Modeled after English ones, of course. And they became really popular. So he first published it in 1797, The Country Builder's Assistant. And this pattern book had really practical advice about how to plan, say, a meeting house, for example. And they were used by carpenters as well, because he gave advice in simple English, not really convoluted language, but language that everyone could read and understand about how to build, in wood or in stone. So these were very accessible to builders and carpenters and architects in the late 18th and early 19th century. He came out with a second book in 1806 called The American Builder's Companion. I like the emphasis on American, right? This is for America, not England, not Europe, right? And this book, the second one here, really emphasizes moldings and fire mantles and things like that. Just everyday things that you would find in a house that you would need help with, right? And finally, he came out with another book in 1830, which, of course, incorporates the Greek orders. So Asher Benjamin, who lived in Windsor for a little bit, by the way, for a couple years, was really instrumental in spreading that knowledge of how to build, and also spreading the Greek Revival style. Because, of course, a lot of builders and carpenters, as they migrated west where the population was going, especially to the Northwest Territories, right? Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. That's why you have so much Greek Revival architecture there, because of Asher Benjamin's books that were carried away with these settlers.